forge your inner armor. Welcome to the Inner Armor Podcast with Dr. Timothy Royer, where we explore ways to train our brains and bodies to become dynamically resilient so that we can all, from professional athletes to ordinary people, perform at our potential. Well, welcome back to the Inner Armor Podcast. My name is Greg Smith, and I am here as always with Dr. Timothy Royer, the founder of Royer Neuroscience and Inner Armor. And we have, once again, a very special guest today. In the last episode, we talked about the brain-body connection in a way that we haven't talked about it before. We've talked often about the way that physical dangers trigger our body's sympathetic state. So when we're being attacked by a bear or whatnot. And we've talked a lot before about psychological stresses, the Doc's famous what ifs and what abouts. But last time we took a deep dive into the physiological stresses that occur in our body, particularly related to diet and nutrition and how that may cause inflammation and other things that trigger our autonomic nervous system to trip into sympathetic mode. So today we're going to continue with that in a very technical way. We're going to get into the chemistry of this. And we have a very special guest who's going to talk to us about the chemistry of nutrition, the chemistry, blood chemistry, and how all that plays out and its interaction with our autonomic nervous system. So, Doc, do you want to introduce this very special guest?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Greg. It's great to have everybody listening today. And, last week we had Amy talk to us, and as you guys remember, she's my wife and my business partner in Royer Neuroscience. And we're keeping it in the family today because I'm really excited to have my daughter, Kate, with us today, Dr. Wierenga. And kind of like Amy had mentioned, her journey, which has been a, lifelong journey with nutrition, but more specifically, improving her education, actually started in seeing things happen with our kids early on and her getting more education in nutrition. And she talked about watching Joe do the keto diet, who's our son. But also for me and Amy, we've learned a lot by watching Katie do her research and delve into the importance of fats and how those fats work. And we've introduced a lot of that into our practice in Royer Neuroscience, where we're actually measuring omega-3 and those kind of things. And this is an area of specialty for Kate. So we wanted to have her join us and walk through the chemistry of this stuff and how that it really impacts our body, what we do eat, but importantly, some of the different nutrients and particularly fats. So Kate, can you kind of give us a little bit of your background of what brings you to where you are today? What are you doing today? And then we'll kind of just start our discussion on omega-3. Katie is joining us today, and she's going to be connecting to us internationally on a phone call. So we're not doing our normal high quality HD recording. So to our listeners out there, if it sounds like Kate is on a phone call and I'm on a phone call, it's because we are, and we're talking across the Atlantic. So Kate, you're joining us from the Netherlands. Can you give us a little bit of your background and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so hello from across the ocean. I am currently working in a lab at Utrecht University. I'm a postdoc. So my project right now is more focused on cancer biology, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. But I've always been very interested in cellular biology. And so that led me to my PhD, which I finished up in 2021, where I studied the effects of omega-3 fatty acids on certain types of immune cells. And I studied how they influence levels of inflammation. And this was working in a lab that was really focused on how these omega-3 fatty acids could play an anti-inflammatory role in autoimmune disease. And so I looked at just one cell type in that whole giant picture. But yeah, I spent 5 years sort of deep diving all of this chemistry behind these omega-3 fatty acids, what they get broken down into, what they're actually doing inside of the cell, and how that influences inflammatory pathogens in that cell. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, I believe.
Yes, we are, because we're very interested, as you know, in managing the autonomic nervous system way upstream and looking at it getting out of balance, either in too much parasympathetic or too much sympathetic, which is when the nervous system is overactivated. And if that's like a 3,000-foot view, what we're doing, you are down at the millimeter view of what's literally happening in the cells that start the whole inflammatory process, which you can have somebody that psychologically things are going well, environmentally things are going well, but they're stuck in sympathetic because they're inflamed. There's some type of inflammatory process. Last week, Amy talked about the gut and how it can get inflamed and leaky gut and autoimmune and those kind of things. But you're really going to take us to the cells and how this all happens, and then looking at how different things that we take in, essential fatty acids. So can you explain a little bit like what's happening cellularly and what is an essential fatty acid?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess maybe we could start with some terms. So we've all heard of fat, right? So it's one of the main macronutrients within the food that we eat. And fat can be broken down into so many different subcategories. So probably listeners have heard of like saturated fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids. And when we talk about essential fatty acids, these are fats that we need to take in through our diet because our body can't make them on our own. So our cells, actually every cell in your body has a membrane around it, so like a wall, and that's made up of fatty acids. And fatty acids play a super important role both in like making that physical barrier around each individual cell, but they also have all sorts of other jobs that they do in the cell. They can act as like signaling molecules. They can get broken down into smaller metabolites that can trigger different responses. But yeah, every cell is fat, and most of those fats we can make on our own. But there's a class that we can't make on our own, and those are the essential fatty acids that you mentioned. And for those, we have to take in through our diet. And the two biggies that we always hear about from the essential fatty acids are the omega-6 and the omega-3 fatty acids. So these ones are really good to, I guess, define. Okay, so the difference between these is where the bonds are. So this gets really technical, especially if you don't have like a picture in front of you. But basically, you can picture a fatty acid as like this long, squiggly tail of carbons and hydrogens. Okay. And in that tail, you have sometimes like a very straight tail. Those are saturated fats. And then you have certain fats that have more of like a squiggly tail, kind of like a zigzag, because they have different types of bonds in them. And they have more of these, what we call double bonds. These are the unsaturated fats. And the essential fatty acids are a type of unsaturated fatty acid that our body just doesn't have like the enzyme or the tool to put a double bond in a specific position in the tail, which is why we have to eat it. Does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense.
Okay.
So what's the difference between a 6 and a 3?
So that just has to do with where you find that bond that I was talking about. So 3 just means that the double bond is 3 carbons from the end of the long tail. 6 just means the double bond is 6 carbons from the end of the long tail. So
okay,
it's, just based on where you see those bonds showing up. Yeah.
And so because it's essential fatty acids, the omega-6s and the omega-3s, they're going to come through what we eat, right?
Yeah, because we can't make those. Like our body doesn't have the enzyme to put that bond in that specific position. And then animals eat those plants, and then we eat the plants and the animals. And so that's how we get those fatty acids into our diet. We can't make them, or into our body. We can't make them ourselves.
Okay, so can you explain to the listeners and also to me again, what's important about the omega-3 ones that we're taking in our diet, and maybe contrast that to the omega-6s?
Yeah, sure. So all the cells in our body have both these omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. However, in the US especially, and in the Western diet, the types of foods we eat have way more of the omega-6s in them compared to the omega-3. And so then what you see happening is when you look at the types of fat that are showing up in our cells, you see more of the omega-6s because, like I said, the only way you're getting the fixed omega-6s and omega-3s into your cells is through your diet. So if you're eating a lot of omega-6s, you have a lot more omega-6s in your cells. And I should clarify that omega-6s aren't bad per se. Like a lot of times in that omega-3 literature, sort of the omega-6s become the bad guy. They serve a lot of really good purposes. But the bigger issue is that we have just such a high amount of omega-6s compared to omega-3s in our diet. And so when I say they act as the bad guys, this is going back to what we know about essential fatty acids and inflammation. So when those omega-6 fatty acids in the cell membrane get broken down and metabolized, they can get turned into all sorts of these different smaller molecules that have inflammatory properties. So maybe, like for example, if you have a fever, one of the metabolites that gets broken down from omega-6 fatty acids is responsible for like helping generate that heat and that inflammatory response that you see with a fever. And so that being said, if your cells are much richer in these omega-6 fatty acids, it's possible that you're generating more of these inflammatory molecules than what you really should be. So there's some nice papers that have shown that like our, hunter-gatherer diet had a much more even split of omega-6 to omega-3 if you compare like the types of foods that people ate, way back. Whereas now we're eating stuff that's much more enriched in omega-6s. And so we're producing more of these inflammatory mediators than what our ancestors way back would have been because they didn't have as many omega-6s incorporated into their cells. So that's kind of the underlying principle of why adding more omega-3 could have this anti-inflammatory effect.
Okay. So for the listener out there, inflammation, what might that be like precursor to in general? If I'm looking to, be a peak performer, or maybe I have somebody or myself that has a clinical thing going on, how does inflammation versus anti-inflammation, how does that impact these different diseases and things?
Yeah. So, I think especially I was a college athlete, so I ran cross country and track in college. So I often think of inflammation in terms of the sore knee or the achy back or whatever, like something's inflamed, something's wrong. And so that, of course, is one area you're going to see it. So when we talk about inflammation, we often talk about like these 5 pillars of inflammation. So you have pain, heat, loss of function, swelling, and redness. That's it, redness. Yeah, redness. So like, of course, if you're inflamed in a joint, for example, you're going to have more pain in that joint. I think like the extreme area we think of when we think of inflammation, especially inflammation that's really gotten out of control, would be like autoimmune diseases or autoinflammatory disorders and diseases where you have, for example, like a rheumatoid arthritis, where there's so much inflammation in that joint that it leaves dysfunction, it's swollen, it's painful. But when I think more about like what role does inflammation play in peak performance, that's where it's like if you go out and do a whole bunch of 400 repeats and you're kind of sore the next day, but the following day your body's able to dissolve the inflammation, you're going to be able to like progress more quickly than someone who takes several days to recover from that because their inflammation was so high following that, tough workout. So that's kind of how I would think of it in terms of peak performance. And then, I don't know, do you want
No,
around that?
it sounds like it's more of a, like, inflammation affects all of us in some way, like, or it can.
Yeah.
From the peak performer to somebody like with cardiovascular disease, which could be related to inflammation or lupus,
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
I would assume almost every disease we experience is worsened by inflammation.
Yeah.
And I've heard some researchers talk about like neuroinflammation, where the brain is actually, inflamed, and that can be a contributor to a lot of the different psychiatric illnesses that we talk about. Is that it's an inflammatory process. I know, particularly in concussion or traumatic brain injury, that there's a cascade of inflammation that when you're trying to recover for something like that, it doesn't sound like you want to have an overabundance of omega-6 in the system, because it's going to be more problematic to recovery. Anybody that wants to function at a high level really needs to be taking into consideration what's going on at the cellular level with the distribution of omega-6 and omega-3.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, when I think about the omega-3 and omega-6 essential fatty acids, when you take these in, they're going everywhere in your body. So there's some really nice studies that show like correlations between, for example, your red blood cell levels of omega-6 or omega-3 fatty acids and tissue levels. So like if your red blood cell levels go up, you also see an increase in your omega-3 levels in the liver and the kidneys and the muscle. So it's going everywhere. So it's like your whole body is getting more of these omega-3 fatty acids. Like you literally are what you eat, right? So you're getting the omega-3 fatty acids. They're getting incorporated into your body. And so you then have more of those. And if those have these like anti-inflammatory properties, then it's endowing all these different tissues with like this extra tool to fight against inflammation, which you're right. But I think a lot of the direction things are going, especially with a lot of these chronic diseases, is their basis is the inflammation, kind of out of control inflammation. And that's showing up in different tissues, right? If you have like some sort of chronic kidney disease, usually it's because of inflammation in your kidney. You have achy joints, inflammation in the joints. Cardiovascular disease, inflammation in the vessels. And so if you're able to kind of give the cells in those areas these extra tools, these extra things to fight against the inflammation, that's a win-win, I think.
So, no, definitely. Yeah. And we're in a culture that, the first thing when something's sore, right, we reach for an anti-inflammatory thing. Yeah. Right. So the NSAIDs and those things, right? Am I in the right area here that these are?
Yeah. So the NSAIDs, actually, NSAIDs, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, the D in NSAID, well, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. Those actually, one thing they do is change certain enzymes, so it makes more of these like teeny tiny lipid metabolites that act like with this anti-inflammatory effect. So that's a separate thing. But kind of like if you're already eating omega-3 fatty acids, you have more omega-3 fatty acids, your kind of the production of these downstream mediators is influenced in a similar way that you can influence it with a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. That's the D.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I remember you put me on to the book Queen of Fats, which listeners out there, fantastic book, easy read. But in there, they were literally talking about the difference between taking Tylenol and Advil and actually using essential fatty acids, omega-3s, and seeing like better results than these things that we just naturally gravitate to when something's sore or something's off, right?
Yeah. Well, it's short-lived, right? If you're taking a Tylenol or an Advil, it's great for like that temporary relief. But if you have your cells already stocked up, basically, or more full with the fatty acids that when they get broken down, they themselves make these anti-inflammatory metabolites, then yeah, I mean, I think they work together. I don't think you're going to always be able to do just one or always be able to do just the other, but for sure, you probably don't need as much of the one if you have more of the other, for example.
Now you're looking in your research at least at your doctoral research, you were looking at in relation to lupus omega-3, right? Without getting too technical, can you kind of explain to us what was going on there? That's not like just taking one omega-3 a day or something, right? It was, what were you looking at there?
Yeah. Good. That's a good question. So I'll talk more about the kind of overarching project our lab was doing, because it better answers your question. So our lab was interested in understanding how omega-3 fatty acids slow down the development and progression of lupus. And so we had these mice that they will develop lupus spontaneously. Lupus is an autoimmune disease that's very common and not very common, but it's most prevalent in women of childbearing age. So women, over 20 years old. And it's really a nasty disease. I mean, it's systemic autoimmune disease. So it influences several organs. And basically your body's immune system sort of fights against itself. So you start producing antibodies, which normally we want to produce antibodies against like bad foreign substances like bacteria. But in the case of lupus, the body gets confused and starts producing all these antibodies against your own tissues. And then your immune system is super powerful, great for eradicating infections, not so great when it's turned on your own tissues. So
wow.
With lupus, have the end stage, if it's untreated with lupus, it's kidney failure because their body attacks the kidneys. But you also see things showing up. For example, they have sometimes lung complications. Often they have skin complications. So it's a nasty disease. Anyway, often lupus is treated with super strong anti-inflammatories and corticosteroids, which, my PhD supervisor used to describe these corticosteroids as a poisonous chalice, which I think is maybe it's a dramatic, but probably accurately to describe it, because they give relief, but probably some listeners know, like, years and years and years on corticosteroids is also not great because those have their own set of side effects. And so sort of the basis of the research in our lab and the justification for why I even look at this is we wanted to find a dietary intervention that would reduce the symptoms of lupus, ideally then requiring less of this super powerful anti-inflammatory steroids. And so we took these mice and we fed them diets that either had a control diet or diets that had the equivalent of taking 2 grams of DHA per day, which DHA is one of those omega-3 essential fatty acids, or 5 grams of DHA per day. And so to put those doses in context, 5 grams is a lot of DHA. I can explain a little later, like how many pills that would be. But 5 grams is actually what's considered safe by basically the European equivalent of the FDA. They say 5 grams is safe. And the only real side effects you have if you go, there, you don't want to go like high above that because there can be, you don't ever want to have too much of one thing, I suppose. But 5 grams is considered safe. And then we also had a 2 gram dose, which we considered like our actually feasible if you're just a normal person, like taking supplements that aren't maybe prescription. And so what we thought is that when we gave these animals an environmental trigger to induce lupus, the animals that were fed this 5 grams a day dose, they had almost, in the period we looked at, they had almost no development of the disease. Whereas the animals that were control diet, their kidneys were horrible. They were full of these autoantibodies. And if you look at, for example, gene expression or levels of inflammatory proteins in their blood plasma, those are super high. So, the DHA reduced or almost completely eliminated like the end stage lupus symptoms, like the kidney response. we did see some of those upstream responses, like the antibodies and things like that. So it's not like it's 100% going to be able to block it. I mean, that's why we have modern medicine as well. And those drugs do serve a purpose, but it certainly reduces symptoms. Which one of my colleagues, she just finished her PhD, so she just is working on getting this publication out, where she shows some really cool results with how that affects how much of the corticosteroids you now need to give animals. So can we actually reduce it? And if we add DHA, can we reduce how much these animals need to see like a beneficial effect? So I don't know if it's published or not published yet, but so I won't say all the results. I don't know if it's a secret. No, they're doing cool stuff at the lab I worked in for my PhD. They're doing really neat stuff to like sort of dig into what is the mechanism of how these omega-3 fatty acids are working and how can they be practically put into place. So that's probably a long answer to your question.
No, it's great because I think it does frame the context for our listener out there that, might not have lupus, okay, might not have a particular, chronic illness, but when we look at how we can take this omega-3 in a way, not at a much different dosing than maybe we knew 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that it's working to keep the system out of inflamed response. And well, maybe I'm not inflamed. Well, we're thinking about inflammation all the time when we mention the word recovery. Okay, so if I've got an athlete out there like, well, I don't have lupus, why am I listening to this podcast? Well, you're dealing every single day with recovery. All of us, when you have disruption in your sleep, your system is not recovering correctly. Okay. When you have disruption in your focus, it's probably because you didn't recover correctly. If we're predisposed to anxiety, stress, you're obsessing, the system is showing us that it's more inflamed or more sympathetic. Now, again, that could be psychological, could be environmental, but we're asking the listeners to look internally at the cellular level to think, are my cells out of balance in the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is then going to predispose me to just easily tilt right into inflammation and poor recovery. So we kind of are building, it's kind of like the mortar between the bricks and how strong that mortar is. And so if we can look at that and fix it, like you said, it's not a one-stop shop, but it's really important to how I'm predisposed. And these are only going to happen via diet. I'm not going to make these things internally. Can you explain, we talk about the ratio of a 6 to 3. Can you explain that a little bit? What's good, what's bad, and maybe why different parts of the world actually have different ratios? Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So, maybe listeners have heard of the omega-3 index. So this is simply the measure of what percent of your red blood cell membrane are omega-3 fatty acids. So often, I know that Inner works, Wierenga Neuroscience both work with a company called Omega Farm. And I'm going to give them a plug because they're a great company. I also worked with them in my PhD. We would send them a bunch of mouse samples that Wierenga Neuroscience from human samples. And what they do is they just take a tiny drop of your blood from your finger and you literally put it on a piece of filter paper, mail it in, and they can take that drop of blood and they can pull out the red blood cell membrane. So in that blood, there's all these, tons of red blood cells in there. Those have a cell membrane, like I talked about earlier. And they look at that cell membrane and they can say what percent of that cell membrane is omega-3 fatty acids. And so if you look all over the world, you can see that countries that consume more fish, for example, Japan, or a really famous example is the Greenland, is it Greenland or Iceland? I think it's Greenland. In Greenland, they eat a lot of fish, seal blubber, whale blubber, just all omega-3. So those places that eat tons of fish, tons of seafood, they have really high omega-3 indices, like in the 8% range, which is what omega-4, 8-10% even, which is what the omega-4 considers like ideal and protective against a variety of different inflammatory diseases. If you look at the U.S., I think probably one of the worst examples, we consume a lot of things, like I mentioned earlier, that are really rich in omega-6s. So a lot of grain-based products. Corn is like really rich in omega-6s. And what do we fry everything in? Corn oil.
Yeah.
And what do we have in everything sweet? High fructose corn sugar. So, well, of course, that doesn't have the fat in it, but like we use so much corn in the U.S. Everything is corn-based. And our animals, our meat are fed grain and corn. And so those animals, their red blood cell membranes and their tissues are now enriched in omega-6s. Then we eat those animals. And so then we become more enriched in omega-6s. And the 3s and the 6s, the same, I'll say, enzymes, but the same proteins that are responsible for taking those fatty acids and basically sticking them inside the wall of the cell. You have the same enzyme doing that for the 6s and the 3s. So it's like a fight, right? So if you have a whole bunch of 6s coming in and just a few 3s, that enzyme just like only sees the 6s and just puts all the 6s into the cell membrane. But if you can shift that balance of how much 6s and 3s you take in, then that enzyme's gonna, be more able to select 6s and 3s and 6s and 3s and put those into the membrane. So that's a big part of it, is because these fatty acids share the same pathways to get into the cell and then to get used by the cell. If you shift the balance of what you're putting into your body, you shift the balance of what's inside of the body. And so, I think looking at how different countries vary is a really cool way to see how that diet of that country literally shows up inside of the person, right?
Yeah. And then the downstream effects on illness and inflammatory disease and that kind of stuff a big component can be these. So you mentioned like some of these countries like Japan, Greenland, where they're eating a lot of fish, index up around 8 to 10%. And here in the US, we'll see an index of 3%, 2%.
Yeah, low.
It's really poor, in meaning that the dominant 6. And so we use these Omega Quant, where we'll send out the kit to people. It's not that expensive, maybe $40. And what we'll do is you'll get back a report of your omega-3 index. And then what's really cool is we'll make some adjustments, because Kate will explain a little bit about this calculator that they use that gives you some guidance on where you want to get to.
Yeah.
But we'll use an increase of omega-3. And I've seen within 6 to 8 weeks, somebody go from a 3 to like a 7%. I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah. And, we talk about inner armor, right? This is like inner armor. I mean, this is like, this is armor around
cellular inner armor.
It's cellular inner armor, right? It's around the cell that you can either have this one that's going to be constantly getting inflamed, which is then going to ripple out to the rest of the body, or you can have this inner armor that is resistant. It's anti-inflammatory. It's strong. And I'll add this one more plug on the index is we've done this with all kinds of individuals, from a highly clinical people with, significant disorders to elite athletes, top of their game. And, we can't say it exactly, but what I see over and over again are these elite athletes come to the table with a better omega-3 index. Now, that's probably because they're watching their diet, maybe not purposely, but they are sourcing their food differently. And, whether that lack of inflammation makes them a little bit more available to perform at a higher level because they're recovering quicker or not is hard to say. But I also see on the reverse side, on the clinical side, people with major clinical issues with very, very poor omega-3 index. And it's not always going to be, 1-to-1 on that. But why not start with something that's as basic as increasing omega-3 and measuring it, that ultimately will set the base for the potential for better performance? So can you explain the index and so how they work with, let's say I've got an index of 2.5, okay, of my omega-3. So I don't have enough omega-3. And then they kind of work this calculator thing. And tell me about the calculator and what they're trying to do through this calculator to change my omega-3 index.
Yeah. So basically with this calculator that Omega Report has, you can put into the calculator what your current omega-3 index level is. So that's how many omega-3 do you have, what percent in your red blood cells. And then it will give you how much EPA and DHA you should take per day to reach the goal, whatever the goal level is for you. So, I think for optimal performance, that'd be 8 to 10%, which probably most listeners don't have unless they're really big fish eaters. But yeah, so I mentioned a bit earlier that we, in my PhD, we use DHA. So this is one of the two main essential omega-3 fatty acids. The other one is EPA. So these two are basically like cousins. They look very similar to each other. They're slightly different in their chemical properties, but they're both omega-3 fatty acids, and they're both the ones that you find when you take a fish oil supplement. So they're very, very high in fish and in fish oil. But you don't want to just grab like any old fish oil supplement off the shelf. You really want to look at the back and see how much EPA and DHA that actually have in there. So the calculator tells you how many milligrams per day of EPA and DHA that you need. So that's not just how many milligrams of fish oil. That's specifically of EPA and DHA. So for example, if I grab my bottle of fish oil, and it probably has, actually I know because I just looked at the top of it today. Half of it contains EPA and DHA. Okay.
Wow.
So in my one capsule of fish oil, I think the serving size for the one I have is 2 capsules. So in the 2 capsules, there's 2 milligrams of fish oil itself. So only half of that is EPA and DHA. So I'm actually only getting 1 milligram.
Gotcha.
Sorry, 1,000, 1 gram. I'm getting 1 gram of EPA and DHA with my 2 capsules, not 2. So I'm getting 2 grams of fish oil, but I'm only getting 1 gram of EPA plus DHA. So that's super important to look for. Like I found that if you just grab any old brand off the shelf, you could be getting anywhere from only like 10 to 30% of like EPA and DHA in there. And sometimes especially if it just says omega-3 supplement, there are precursors. So fatty acids that are sort of like EPA and DHA, but not exactly. Those are precursors to EPA and DHA. Those are healthy. They are beneficial, but they're not going to raise your omega-3 index as fast. So a lot of times if you just see like an omega-3 supplement at a store, it'll have quite a bit of those precursor molecules in it, which they're not worthless, but they're not packing as big of a punch as the EPA and DHA. So if you really want to raise that omega-3 index fast, you have to take in those two specifically. They're the big players there.
So Kate, we've been talking a lot about this and at a very deep cellular level, but it has meaning as we talked about inflammation and recovery. So in the countries where, we see better omega-3 index, so they're eating either directly more fish or they're eating meats that have that are feeding off of green things, grass fed. What do we see physically, health-wise for these places? Do we see differences in their health? Of course, we look at the United States, we're probably worse on the charts and a lot of things like obesity and heart disease and those kind of things. But what have you kind of seen there?
Yeah, I think it's probably hard to make really strong comparison from one country to country on to say the omega-3 index is the thing doing it, right? Because there's so many other factors that differ from country to country. But I will say the thing that kicked off the whole omega-3 field was this observational study in this population in Greenland where they saw that these people that eat this super omega-3 rich diet had really low levels of thrombosis, I think. So yeah, cardiovascular disease. And that really started the whole omega-3 field with this odd finding of like, wow, these people that eat all these fish, they are much healthier. They have much better like heart health. There are several studies where they do look at different, even like brain health specific things like anxiety or depression. And they have measured omega-3 indices with people that have higher anxiety or higher levels of depression. And there they do see some differences. Omega Quant has some really nice blog articles actually. So I'm going to point to them because I think in those blogs, they also cite a lot of their important references, things like that. But they have some really nice blogs looking at the connection between omega-3s and depression, the connection between omega-3s and anxiety. And yeah, there is definitely some link there between higher omega-3 index and in general, less of some of these diseases that may have some diseases or disorders that may have some inflammatory basis. Yeah.
Yes. Great. Well, as we finish up, I know this is a really deep dive for our listeners, but it's a very important dive to think about what we're taking in. I know you've mentioned before, you could have two eggs, different types of eggs sitting on a shelf in a grocery store, and one could be more inflammatory and another one could actually be anti-inflammatory if we're looking at how those eggs were sourced, because it's important to be thinking about how we're fueling our body, especially in this whole idea of recovery. Any last things, Kate, that you would leave our listeners in relation to this discussion, maybe a starting point or just kind of a take home that just the average person out there never heard this stuff before and they're trying to build their inner armor. What might be a good starting point for them?
Yeah, I think that the best starting point is figuring out what your omega-3 index is. And we talked about Omega Quant, that's the source Inner Armor uses. There's probably other things out there, but like a lot of things Inner Armor does, like it's being more aware of where your body is. It's another level of biofeedback, So it's the biofeedback you do with the breathing and the EEG training, et cetera, is like real time. You can see what's happening, what's changing. Whereas this, it takes your cells a while to remodel their membrane. But why not get an idea of where they are right now so you can know how you can make it better? So when I've done these Omega Quant tests, I like to do one and then do another one 6 months later and see, okay, I made a few changes. Did it actually have an effect? And depending on how aggressively you go after it, you probably will see an effect. So it's just good to get a baseline, get an idea of where you're actually at, and then figure out what meaningful things you can do to change.
That's awesome. And we've learned today just how those may have a downstream effect in a lot of other areas. So we're super excited to have this level of expertise on the podcast and for teaching us so much about omega-3s, and encourage our listeners to look forward to learning more about that. But thanks, Dr. Wierenga, Kate, for being with us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge on this topic. And for our listeners, encourage you to get to Inner Armor or Royer Neuroscience. Royer Neuroscience may do a few more of these deeper dives with you if you'd like to learn more about that. Greg, it was kind of fun having Kate on today. Any last words from you?
Oh, this was fantastic. And I think that as we deepen our understanding of the brain and body connection, that really opens the doors to new understandings of your own health and your own potential. And Inner Armor is committed to helping everyone to reach their potential and to be the best that they can be. So go to forgeinnerarmor.com. If you also want to get a grip on the fundamental science involved in the brain-body connection, you can read the book Forge Your Inner Armor, available at Amazon.com. This has been the Inner Armor Podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Would you please follow or subscribe and make sure to leave us a review or comment. You can learn more about Inner Armor, Dr. Royer, and how to perform at your potential by going to forgeinnerarmor.com.